I'm making this as sort of a channel trailer / closer for the topic that got me started making video essays in the first place, that being the manga Jujutsu Kaisen. First, we need a little bit of backstory. Back when the manga was getting started on its route to finishing up, at around the part that comes directly after what has been so far adapted by the anime, I remember being very frustrated with the direction the writing had taken. Since the iconic and explosive Shibuya arc, the manga's author, Gege Akutami, had sidelined the series' only female deuteragonist, frequently begun shifting the perspective away from the main characters, and, from what I saw, just completely given up on writing any significant moments of character interaction or introspection. Two aspects of the series' writing that made it stand out to me when I first watched the anime and set it apart from any other shonen series I read. The plot was rushed along without regard for any of these details that matter so much when telling any story. When I expressed these frustrations to people in public spaces and forums dedicated to the series, however, I found that there were very few people who shared my concerns about the direction in which the series' writing was heading. I know my mistake now, of course, in that most people are normal and very few people read action manga solely out of interest in the writing. Most of the die-hard fans you see on Reddit and Twitter are there for the fights, and any analysis of the text they engage with will usually be in the form of power scaling or some complaint about the art style. And yes, the fights in JJK are good, but that's not enough to make a story that stands out among the sea of action manga in the world already. It's why a series like Chainsaw Man, which has a very similar premise but is probably twice as bizarre, still manages to consistently garner mainstream appeal due to Fujimoto's dedication to his characters and themes. These are the things that set a great shonen apart from a good shonen. Qualities that I felt were slipping from Akutami's writing. So, feeling like my criticisms were being consistently overlooked and without anyone left to vent my frustrations to, I took to YouTube and made my very first video essay. It was very short, my mic quality wasn't great to begin with, and on top of that I pitch shifted my voice because of how much I hated listening to it while editing. But it was a labor of love for a series I was genuinely invested in. In it, I mainly focused on the aforementioned female deuteragonist, Nobara, and her treatment in the series.
Fortunately, the series isn't over yet, and there's still room for Gege to fix some of these issues before it ends.
But I realize now that Nobara was more of a canary in the coal mine than anything, and her issues were indicative of overarching problems with the series' pacing that wouldn't end up resolving themselves anytime soon. Pacing is a writing word that people tend to throw out a lot to criticize long-form media formats like this, but I want to be abundantly clear about what I mean when I say that. Pacing in this case refers to how each scene in a work of art flows together, and good pacing usually requires maintaining a balance between the amount of cool, high-stakes action sequences you have and when, and the scenes that you include to give the audience time to process the action and how it impacts the characters and story. Think of the Kyoto exchange event arc, and the whole baseball episode that followed the big fight scenes after the arc's conflict had been pretty much resolved. By the time that video came out, around the beginning of the second section of the Culling Games arc, there were already glaring flaws in the way the tension of the series was being built up and released, which is an incredibly important rhythm to keep in mind when writing an action story like this. To use Chainsaw Man as an example, a series people usually consider fast-paced, there is no point in the series where the author is just throwing new fights at you over and over and over again, often with multiple characters the audience isn't familiar with at all. The way the arcs go is that typically there will be a few chapters at the beginning of the arc establishing the 2 or more characters that will inevitably end up fighting and why, and then about an equal amount of time spent on the actual fight itself. The pacing of the series may seem like a roller coaster off its rails when you're reading it, but Fujimoto remembers to always give room for the tone to wind down between fights. This makes the fights feel rewarding and story-driven, sure, but it also gives crucial time to the characters to interact, and, well, be characters. There's not a lot of time in the middle of a fight scene for a character to explore their emotions and motivations, especially if you didn't take the time before that fight to establish why they're choosing to fight, how they feel about their opponent, and what that fight means in the context of their greater character arc. Plus, with a premise that basically splits up your main protagonists from each other, i.e. the Culling Games, that extra time is even more crucial to explore the characters' interactions with one another. The main emotional anchor of Part 1 of Chainsaw Man is the familial bond that is gradually formed between the protagonist and 2 deuteragonists, Denji, Power, and Aki. And even though all 3 of them are rarely, if ever, interacting for long periods of time during their fight scenes, the series takes lots and lots of time showing their interpersonal development outside of fights. So by the end of this part of the series, there is no doubt that these three love each other, mainly because it spends so much time convincing you through moments rooted solely in character interaction. Jujutsu Kaisen does this pretty well too, especially early on into the series. Moments like Nobara and Megami mourning Yuji, Yuji befriending Junpei, and everything going on between Gojo and Geto really feel convincing, with how they show the genuine bonds that inevitably form between young people staking their lives on horrifying missions that no one will thank them for, and make the more tense moments of collaboration, betrayal, and triumph during the fight scenes pay off 1,000,000 times more than they would have without that downtime. Shibuya, as amazing as it was, threw a big ol' wrench into the series' pacing up to that point. Almost 100 chapters of non-stop, high-energy fighting. Of course I loved what I was reading, but my next thought immediately defaulted to wondering how they would alleviate all of the tension and energy being built up from fight scene to fight scene. Not that I thought it would be too hard. There would be plenty for all the characters to talk and think about, with Gojo sealing in the deaths of numerous of their allies all in one arc. Plus, the series basically landed a perfect foil dynamic in Akutami's lap with Yuji and Choso, a pair who I still think have one of the most exciting fights in the series, with one of the most creative twists at its resolution. Here you have a protagonist who hates himself to the point of suicidal ideation because his body is inhabited and in many instances controlled by an evil sorcerer who he let in, also that he can one day die and take Sukuna down with him. During Shibuya, his body was used to demolish an entire swath of innocent civilians, a deed that he blames himself singularly for in spite of his lack of agency during the time it happened, and his other great victory over his cursed nemesis Mahito. Plus, one of his mentor figures was killed and the other was trapped in a box. With him you have Choso, probably already the most emotionally vulnerable character in the series, and one whose motivation revolves around protecting and loving his brothers and hating the person who created them. He spent most of the series up to this point trying to kill Yuji for killing two of his brothers, only to discover after very nearly killing him that Yuji is his brother too. The character interaction writes itself once you think for 5 seconds about what kind of dilemmas these two characters might present to the other, especially when you add the revelation that Yuji's birth was also part of Kenjiku's machinations. To accept Choso's help on Yuji's side would be to accept that part of himself is not human, and was likely created for the explicit goal of being a vessel for Sukuna. It would also mean he has to come to terms with his already deeply internalized remorse over killing Choso's other two brothers, something Choso himself has chosen to put behind them. Chosen. But I don't want to dwell on this kind of missed opportunity thing for too long, mainly because I want to keep this video within a 5-pages single-spaced 11-point Arial font limit. There are a lot of things I could talk about that have to do with what JJK could have done and didn't, but I really want to focus on what the series did do and why it failed. Post-Shibuya plot acceleration aside, I honestly think that the Culling Games arc is where the pacing really starts to drop off the map. Starting strong with a really creative fight between a lawyer who uses his curse technique to punish people for crimes they perceive themselves as having committed, and Yuji, who pretty much forfeits by admitting wrongdoing in Sukuna's killing of thousands in Shibuya. But then the arcs after that start to gradually shift the focus away from the main characters in favor of showing off new techniques, and to use a phrase that I didn't have at the time but which describes this phenomenon perfectly, hype moments and aura. I don't really care to talk about the Culling Games as a whole in all that much detail because this is the essence of its content. The fights are plenty cool and creative. I think the Kishimo and Hikari fight is easily a highlight of the series, but there's not any real stakes in the story aside from collecting points. It's like this whole Culling game plot was formulated to have as many random fights as possible back to back to prevent the audience from thinking at all about what the hell Kenjiku's plan even involves at this point, or where Nobara is. I really think it would be more efficient to focus on what I consider to be JJK's last best arc, that being perfect preparation. Before the Culling Games and after some rushed narrative progression and vague avoidance of anything having to do with addressing Nobara's whereabouts, Yuji and Megami & Co. come across Maki back at Jujutsu Tech, finding that she has been scarred beyond recognition by Sukuna and Jogo's Shibuya fight. This leads to a sequence where Maki goes to the Zenin clan that exiled her after abusing her for her sex and lack of cursed energy to try to access their trove of cursed tools. And I was gonna give this like its whole own summary, but I figured I would just paraphrase it here. Mai's dad locks her and Maki in what is essentially a big closet full of cursed spirits. There's a big death sequence with Mai that's actually pretty heart-wrenching, where Mai explains to Maki that she can't reach her full potential as a sorcerer because of some twin binding vow. And so, anticipating her death, she uses her curse technique one more time to make a sword for Maki and tells her to kill their whole family. which she does. And this whole sequence is just very well paced compared to basically everything that comes after it. There's enough, time spent exploring each of the Zenin clans, powers and stuff. Naoya's dynamics with Maki and Mai are explored. Mai and Maki get, enough time for it to feel, actually heartfelt and meaningful. On its face, yes, this is a pretty simple power fantasy of a girl losing her sister and then killing everyone who had a hand in their mistreatment. But if you're anything like me and you've been keeping up with the story for so long up to this point, especially having recognized some of the places where Akutami had failed to give attention to many of his female characters, then you'll probably think this is among the strongest the series has been up to this point. Almost every moment with Maki before this has focused on her trauma growing up in the Zenin clan and how that has followed her and Mai's relationship and reputation as sorcerers. But Maki is a wild card. Her family severely underestimates her physical prowess and combat experience, even though Gojo and everyone else at the school knows that she is unmatched in hand-to-hand combat and cursed tool usage. The dedication she makes at the end of her first year is to prove them wrong about her, something she considers only possible if done by herself with no assistance. Seeing that goal actualized is satisfaction on a platter. If you're also someone who spends enough time thinking about the media you watch to want to write video essays, then you might be put off by Akutami's immediate and insistent comparison of Maki to Toji, another Zenin who shared Maki's trait of having net zero cursed energy output, but was so powerful and feared that he very nearly killed Gojo that one time. I can hear you libs out there asking, but why does her prowess need to be compared to a man's? Isn't her strength enough for her to stand on her own? But her many similarities to Toji are thematically important, just as the things that make them different. The idea of having zero cursed energy output, though it seems like that just means someone who doesn't have magic at all, is a very unique trait that ties into the themes of JJK's power system having laws of equivalent exchange and binding vows. Because most normal people still produce just a little bit of cursed energy, Toji's complete lack of it makes him undetectable to sorcerers in many ways and automatically buffs his physical combat prowess in exchange. It's also a trait Maki only got right after the death of Mai because of a binding vow tied into their birth as twins. Like Maki, Toji was discriminated against because of his lack of ability by the Zenins, who value power only in traditional sorcery techniques more closely bound to the family's bloodline. He spent his adult life resenting the Zenins for their treatment of him and aspiring to a level of strength that would prove that they underestimated him. In the end, though, he is killed by a bloodline technique more powerful than anything the Zenins could have hoped to produce, without ever having the chance at proving what he was worth to his family. While Maki seems to share Toji's long-running motivation to prove his strength to the conservative Zenins, his commitment to this goal is where the most important distinction between the two lies. Maki never had a chance at changing her family's opinion of her, not only because of her lack of powers, but also the simple fact of her being a woman. They would have killed her just like Mai if she did anything more to directly challenge their perception of her. The core difference between them being that Toji never followed through on that threat, because he spent his life trying to prove himself to the very people who rejected him from birth. In this moment, Maki knows that her strength will never be enough for the Zenins if they don't experience it directly. And what better moment to prove that than when all of them are out to kill her already? If there's one thing Akutami is consistent about, it's the energy and tension packed into every panel in his fight scenes. And this is no exception. It's especially fun when it's just one person doing acrobatic moves to kill a throng of people with her sword. But there was actually some troubled production behind the first chapter of this fight sequence, which involved 2 pages in the chapter being released as sketches, and only being updated during its volume release. I didn't really see why this was a big deal at first. From what I could find, it seemed like Akutami was sick during the time of this chapter's production, and I don't think having a couple drafts included in a chapter is a big deal under these circumstances. It could even be seen as a cool behind-the-scenes look at his sketching style for those who read weekly. I don't know if that kind of thing is actually appealing if you're not an artist, though. But the outcry he got for this chapter, or specifically these 2 pages, was not insignificant, even considering he drew 2 color pages along with this chapter as well. And this is the first instance of his art getting sloppy like this in any way. Of course everyone loved to see Maki live her John Wick girl boss fantasy, but in the end this didn't spare Akutami from criticism directed toward these 2 pages. Even in the face of crushing managerial oversight and impossible to achieve deadlines, the audience still turned against him. even just for a moment. The pacing of Jujutsu Kaisen was getting sloppy already by this point in the series, at least in my opinion. It's not hard to see that around the ending of Shibuya is where it seems like Akutami just starts to lose interest in doing the heavy lifting of making his story a story, with character-focused scenes and steady pacing and moments of introspection. But I think Perfect Prep is one of the few later examples where the author takes that time to let the audience feel what the character is feeling, and experience the true payoff of an arc that he'd been building up ever since Maki's introduction. I know I can be very critical, especially when it comes to games and other media, but I try not to be too hard on a production like this because I think it's fair to say that weekly manga is one of the most labor-intensive mediums in modern storytelling. Movies and video games take an immense amount of work from an entire team of people who spend months and years working together to make a product that, ideally, will reflect the best ability of each contributor. But with manga, even though you might have editors, revisionists, and background artists, the bulk of the labor is being done by one person. The writing, the drafting, the drawing. All of it. That's not only planning your story, but also doing multiple layers of sketch and ink by hand for each page you include in a chapter. Every week, until you have a finished story, no matter how grueling the work can get. The creator of Hunter x Hunter famously suffered from chronic back pain after years of keeping his manga going, leading him to have to take frequent hiatuses and pretty much losing the ability to draw at all without lying down. I find it hard enough to maintain interest long enough to finish my scripts and videos. The world is not ready to see my 8,000 word Persona 5 video, but neither am I because I haven't written a conclusion yet. To not only be solely responsible for the original story you're making week by week, but also have to deal with oversight and demand from audiences and corporate executives in real time is inconceivable to me. And then to be on the receiving end of so much public and no doubt private backlash after having one slip up with 2 pages of one of your best chapters? What's the point in focusing all of your energy on trying to craft a beautiful story if no one will tolerate a mistake you make once? If you can play it safe and guarantee your story will appeal to every hungry shonen fan by stripping it of all of its nuance and complexity, and shoving as many high-energy fight scenes as you possibly can into its run, then why wouldn't you go with that option? Why draw it out unnecessarily with quieter scenes that everyone will call filler anyway and just keep you from wrapping up the story? Why take the chance? I'm not saying that Akutami completely gave up on his manga after being criticized once. I think the rest of the series has some good moments, though admittedly much less than I had come to expect. I just think that the Perfect Prep arc is probably the last arc I really felt had a great amount of heart put into it, and that felt at all close to Akutami at his best. Besides the Takaba vs Kenjiku fight, which is probably my favorite in the manga, but I genuinely don't think you can fuck that up with a power as amazing as Takaba's. It was everything I was hoping for when he was first introduced, and it was great from start to end. A perfect closer for Kenjiku, and an amazing opportunity for Akutami to flex some of those funny muscles of his. I just think that by the end of this arc and through into the Culling Games, his interest in the series had run its course. Maybe because of criticism, both external and internal, but also maybe because of literally any other reason. There's a lot of ways someone can lose interest in a project, and I don't fault Akutami for having experienced that. That's just how art is made. But I really do believe that Jujutsu Kaisen could have been something great. If not on Chainsaw Man's level, then at least very close to it. There's plenty about the series as it is to love though, and I really recommend giving it a try if you haven't already. If you have, then check out these other video essays that dive deep into some of the series' more complex aspects. I'm very interested to see what Akutami has in store for us next, and I hope he can keep getting paid to pursue his passion of drawing buff shirtless men while also doing so on a creative schedule that works for him. I'm not going to spend any more time than I already have critiquing any part of the manga. JJK got me to start making videos. I was into it during a formative period of my life, and it holds a very special place in my heart. With this video, I'm hoping to put the topic to bed, but I want to close off by acknowledging how monumentally important it has become to both the world and myself. Jujutsu Kaisen 0 was the first movie I saw in theaters after COVID. I went with another gay nerd from my high school. I haven't experienced anything like it since. It's so thrilling to see something you're already really into on the big screen. The theater was packed with fans just like us, and I got chills seeing not only the incredible fight sequences coming to life, but also those flashbacks to the hidden inventory arc. Snapshots of scenes that had already driven me crazy in the manga, but were yet to come in the anime. I couldn't have been more excited, and me and my friend walked out of the theater gushing about how amazing the movie was. Specials is one of my favorite anime intros of all time, and More Than Words makes me violently ill whenever I watch it. I still think JJK deserves a comprehensive queering just to show how well it was able to resonate with a very specific demographic of young LGBT people, and how many queer-adjacent themes are littered throughout the work. But that's a video for another day, and probably another YouTuber entirely. It made me happy forever when Akutami introduced a trans character in the form of Kirara. Mahito is still one of my favorite villains of all time. I just think he's so fun. Thank you for watching. Please don't take my criticisms in bad faith, and leave a like or subscribe if you enjoyed. Above all, have a great day.